Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. I hope you're doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Okay, today on the Dungeon Dive, we are going to take a look at the Hexflower Game Engine. The Hexflower Game Engine is a tool that you can overlay on top of just about any kind of role-playing game, and this tool can be used for a variety of things, such as exploring wilderness, creating dungeons, and even some kinds of social interactions. It's a very flexible tool, but it is not it's not as intuitive as I would like in some areas, and it's one that it's a tool that I don't see used often. And I think with the proper introduction, more people can get into using the Hexflower game engine for a variety of things in their games. So I believe that the engine has been developed by Goblin's Henchman. You can get a whole bunch of this stuff that I'm going to show today on DriveThruRPG. And then Goblin's Henchman also has a blog at goblinshenchman.wordpress.com. And I'll post a link to that. And they have all kinds of useful information at the blog there. So what is a Hexflower game engine? A Hexflower game engine is like a random table, but with a memory. That is, the last outcome has an effect on the next outcome. I'm sure that a lot of people here have run into that problem where you are creating a hex crawl, you are rolling on random terrain charts, and that things just end up being too random. You move into a desert, then into a forest, then into the mountains, then into the plains, then into a swamp. And there isn't a rhyme or reason. There isn't a natural progression to the terrain like you might find in nature. And so one of the problems that the Hexflower game engine solves is that problem of terrain randomness, but it can also be used for a variety of different things. So a Hexflower game engine is comprised of two parts. You have the main Hexflower here, which is a hex made up of 19 smaller hexes. And then you have a navigation hex, and the navigation hex dictates how you will move around your hex flower. Most of the time, your navigation hex is going to be a roll of a 2d6, and that is going to determine which direction you move a little marker on your hex flower to. For those of you who know a little bit about dice, you know that a 2d6 roll will give you a bell curve, and so there are certain numbers that you are more likely to hit. A standard navigation hex will have the 12 at the top, because often in a hex flower, the last hex of 19, this is where you are trying to get to win that mini game. As you go down, you will get closer and closer to the bottom. And then as you move in different directions, you will move to different hexes that will have different outcomes. They will have different kinds of encounters, different kinds of terrain, different kinds of things, different kinds of little things that will govern the that will govern this little mini game that you are playing. You can also have different kinds of navigation hexes. You could use a D10. You could take the inverse of this to where the 12 is at the bottom, so you have a greater chance of going towards your destination. And we'll talk a little bit about why you might want to do that later. But this Hexflower cookbook kind of walks you through the guiding principles, the philosophy of using a Hexflower game engine in a variety of different ways. Now, with that standard navigation hex that we just talked about with the 2d6 roll with the 6 and 7 on the bottom, that is going to give you a trend of movement through your hex flower. You will have a better chance of moving down and to the left. So if you are trying to get to this last hex and you are using this standard navigation hex, it's going to be a challenge to get to the top. And so that kind of creates your narrative drive. That will create the different kinds of things that you have to overcome as you are moving up on your hex flower. If we took the inverse of that, then we would be moving up and to the left. And so you can kind of think of that in ways that when you are designing your hex flowers, if you want to design them, you can start to think about how your navigation hex is going to drive the narrative of the story, of the adventure, of the campaign that you are currently playing. There are also opportunities to, as you move to the edge of a hex, you can loop back around to the other side. And this can give kind of moments of chaos, of big changes. And that can be big dramatic changes in a narrative story, or it could be big geographical changes in a hex crawl, in a game of exploration. You can also have little X's where you can block movement. And so this is a really good example here on a terrain hex flower, where you might start in the plains, and as you work your way up the hex flower, you will move from the plains. Along this side, you will move into the forest, and then you will move into hills, and then you will move into mountains. And here we have these X's that are blocking movement from those mountains, so you can't go from a mountains straight into a plains. You have to start moving backwards, back down into the hills, back down into the forest, and then into the plains at the bottom. And then the left-hand side of the hex flower has you moving in from the plains into desert, into an arid region, and then into hills, and then into mountains. So it gives you this really nice natural progression from one terrain to the other. And it just adds a little bit more of a rhyme or a reason to your exploration. There are also ways to use hex flowers to generate weather. You might start with a 50-50, a sunny, partly sunny day. And as you move up, you move into a more extreme weather. The left-hand side, you move up, you move into more sunny weather. And the right-hand side, you move into more rainy weather. And this also will prevent a drastic jump from one extreme to the other because of the way that the navigation works. Goblin's Henchman also goes into developing your own hex flower game engines using the various hexes within your hex flower to have small groupings of hexes have meaning. So perhaps you have around the upper hex here where your destination might be. The 3 hexes that surround that hex are called the collar. And so those can be created to have certain narrative things that might impact your final destination. Then you have lobes off to the side, the 3 on the left and the 3 on the right. And those can be, as he says, I often give the upper left lobe and upper right lobe of the hex flower independent themes. In the case of the terrain hex flower, the left lobe is arid and the right lobe is trees. The center hex of a hex flower is often kind of a wild card space for just other kinds of maybe weird things that you might discover. And oftentimes the bottommost hex is the starting hex. There are ways to create terminal hex flowers where when you reach a certain point, then that mini game is complete. It's done. One example that he has here is the volcano eruption tracker. So this is a hex flower that keeps track of the progression of a volcanic eruption. And we start with a calm in the calm area. And as we move up, then we get into the eruption point. And once that eruption point happens, then that little mini game is done. So in this instance, we could use a hex flower to be kind of like a timer in a game, something that is ticking away to an endpoint. And once that endpoint is reached, then that point in the narrative is reached. You can also have a law and justice hex flower. And this is where we start getting into using hex flowers for social interactions in games. And this is when you might want to have 2 different navigation hexes inversed. So you have one with the 12, a roll of a 2d6, one with the 12 on the bottom, one with the 12 on the top. As we progress up on this social hex flower, things will get better for our player characters. As we go down, things get worse, and you start in the center. So if you were on trial, let's say, and your characters had to prove that they were innocent, they would have to make social checks. And as they made successful social checks, then you would use the this hex flower to have a better chance, or this navigation hex to have a better chance to move up to that innocent hex. if they were failing their social challenges, then they might use the negative hex navigation, and the negative navigation hex, and then they would move down to where they are guilty. But you could have a whole bunch of different, maybe you're trying to win the favor of a lord. And I kind of started developing one here where my characters would be trying to gain the favor of like a boss, of a pit boss, or of the boss of an adventure guild or something like that. And throughout the campaign, I would be going on quests for this boss. And as I successfully solved the quest or did missions for the boss, it would be easier for me to move up to where I finally wanted to reach this final hex here, to where I would have an in with the boss. I would be accepted into that guild. I would be one of the new right-hand men. I would have favor with that particular guild. And I developed this hex flower here. This is just really rough. I just kind of wanted to see what I could do in a few minutes before I made this video. Starting down here, and then we have these hexes here, which color the beginning hex. And as we would take social interactions, it would take a social interaction to move past one of these. And this would be a neutral interaction, a negative interaction, and a positive interaction. And then as we moved up through here, maybe if we got up to the lobes up here, on the left-hand side, this is more negative. And if we ever moved into one of these hexes, then the boss would send kind of a watching agent, somebody to join our party who was keeping track of us because maybe the boss didn't trust us. And so for the next few missions, we would have this guy who wasn't really helping, and he was just kind of like taking notes on what we were doing. Whereas if we moved up to the upper right-hand lobe, then we started to gain more favor with the boss. And in that instance, the boss would send a helping agent, a helpful henchman to the party, to our party, to give us assistance in the next few missions. I was just kind of trying to develop a way that you could use a hex flower in an interesting social, for interesting social interactions in a solo role-playing game, because that is one thing that is kind of hard to do in a solo game, is have those social interactions without somebody else playing the opposing force. And this little mini game kind of handles that for you. Here we have also a hex flower made for if you were competing against a rival hunter or a rival group of adventurers. You could use this system here. And in this instance, they also introduced 3 concepts called insight, reconnaissance, and clues. And these are little points that you can get, kind of like the clue points in For Against Darkness. And you can check those off, and then you can spin those to move in more beneficial directions on the hex flower, as long as you can come up with some kind of a narrative reason for that existing. Then we get into a little bit of the profile of the directions, a little bit of philosophy on probability and how to use your navigation hexes. We also have a hex flower here on determining the race of characters, of orcs and dwarves and humans, and their relationship. So it's a very robust tool, and I wish there was more instructional videos out there. Goblin Henchman has some instructional videos, but they are more they're incorporated more in a play session, and so I don't find them particularly useful for finding out information. Here he does have, though, a very detailed example. This is like, how many pages is this? I think it's about 12 pages or so, 7 pages, a 7-page, very detailed explanation of how to use a hex flower for dungeon creation, for dungeon exploration. And they call this In the Heart of the Delve and Dangerous. And this is an annotated example of play where they go into how you roll your dice, how you apply your dice to your various navigation hexes and your hex flowers. It's very, very well written and very useful. And I wish that these kinds of detailed instructions existed for the other kinds of hex flower game engines. Let's take a look real quick at some practical uses. So I have taken my character that I developed in the Talisman Adventure RPG, but I have transposed that character back into my favorite game system, which is, of course, Scarlet Heroes here. And so this is Rodney Barrowsmith, and Rodney Barrowsmith is a human. He is a thief slash tomb robber. I'm going back all the way. I'm saying that this version of Rodney Barrowsmith that I'm going to be playing with is in flashback. And I am telling the stories, all the stories of how Rodney Barrowsmith became a world-renowned tomb robber and how he went out and looked for things in tombs and crypts and dungeons in order to gain the wealth to open up his business, Divers Incorporated, which I introduced in the Talisman Adventure RPG. And so this is my character, and I'm going to be using some hex flowers to generate things, to generate some adventures for Rodney Barrowsmith. But I did want to give just a really quick introduction to maybe how I would use the hex flower to generate a hex crawl, and then kind of maybe go into a dungeon. So, in the Heart of the Unknown, this is the hex flower game engine created by Goblin Henchman to dictate, to govern hex crawling adventures. And in this hex flower game engine, we are starting in a small settlement, so I'll put a little token there. We are starting in the plains, so I'll put a little token there. And we are starting on a day that is partly cloudy, so just a nice peaceful weather day. So we have all of these different icons. We have a large settlement or a destination. So this is going to be our main destination. When we reach this hex here, that means we have found the dungeon that we are looking for. But this could be a large settlement, city, or a destination. We also have small or starter settlements. We have hexes that will signal the sign of civilization. We have these little dinosaur icons, and those are wandering monsters. And then along the right-hand side here, we have an encounter table of monsters that we might encounter. This was filled in for us by Goblin Henchman, but you can also download blank hex flower engines sheets that have blank encounter tables along the right-hand side, so you can make your own encounter tables. And I made my own encounter table here to coincide with the dungeon crawling hex flower engine. And then we have a lair. We might find a monster lair or a bandit settlement, that kind of thing. We might find a dungeon or a special feature out in the land, a special ruin, a fountain, or something like that in the center hex. We have natural hazards or natural obstacles. They could be rivers with bridges collapsed, different things, a cliff wall that you might have to scale. We have nature, camp, hireling, mount, and equipment trouble. And so I use those to be things that you have to do survival checks on. Maybe when you hit one of those hexes, you have to take you might have a camp mishap. You might have a hunting mishap. You have to restock your supplies, that kind of thing. And then we have rivers and roads. And rivers and roads are a little complex. I'm still unclear exactly how roads work. And I think that's because I was approaching this more as a tool for the solo player. And so I would expect it, in that sense, I would expect it to have more things laid out for me. But this is not specifically made for a solo player. This is made for a GM, for a group. So you have to bring a little bit to this if you are playing solo. And then we have our terrain. We've already taken a look at the terrain engine in the Hexflower Cookbook. We have plains. Plains move into forests, into hills, into mountains, or plains might move into arid regions, deserts, into hills, and then into mountains. And then we've also taken a look at our weather engine, which goes from partly sunny up to extreme. On the left-hand side, we have more sun. On the right-hand side, we have more rain. So let's take a couple examples here. I'm going to, let's see here. I'll just start here. Let's say we're in this hex here. We are in plains, and we are in a small settlement, okay? And so from here, we want to explore this hex. We're going to go into this hex here. So let's see what we find. So we rolled a 7. So a 7 on this navigation hex makes us go down. So starting here, we cannot go down. That is blocked off, because if we were to go down, we would loop back around to our destination. So this hex flower prevents that. So we actually move into another settlement. We have another settlement here. On the terrain engine, we rolled a 7. Down is blocked. If we had rolled an 8 or 4 or 5, an 8 or 9 or 4 over 5, we would have moved into another area of plains, but we are staying in place. So we are still in the plains. And we can't go from partially sunny to extreme weather, so we are staying in partially sunny. So not a lot of change. We've moved from one small settlement into another part of a small settlement. Maybe this is a group of lakeside villages or something like that. All right, so let's roll again here. Okay, a 7. All right, so same thing. We are moving in. Again, just a little small series of villages along some plains. And a 5. Okay, so a 5, we're going to move down and to the right. So down and to the right here, we actually loop around to this icon here, which is a wandering monster with an asterisk. And that means that the wandering monster is either distant or improbable. So maybe we come across a monster that we have a chance to avoid because we see them off in the distance. Here we roll a 5, and so we move up into the plains still. So we are up here. And now we're into a little bit of sunny and with some rain breaks there. Or some rain with some sun breaks. I'm not a weatherman. I don't know. But we find some kind of monster here. Maybe we can avoid it. We could roll now, since we're in the plains. Now we could roll on our encounter table to see what kind of monster we see in the distance. And that's a D10, D6. So that was 11 plus 2. We are in the plains. So 13. There is a bear out in the plains. Maybe the bear is hunting. We're along a lakeside, so the bear is hunting for some fish or something like that. Okay, so now let's go into this hex here. And we have another 7. Okay, so now we can loop around. So we can go from this hex here. We would come all the way over to this hex. Here, we would come all the way over to here. So now we are moving into the hills. So we have some hills here. And then we would move all the way up to there. And so now we are in a very sunny, it's very hot. We've moved into the foothills. There's some kind of natural disaster here. So I would look up, find something that I could roll up a natural disaster or think of something. Maybe it's really hot. And so maybe I'm running out of water, or the ground has cracked, and the ground is very dangerous because it's cracking and crumbling underneath my feet. So maybe I have to make some kind of agility test to get past that cracking ground, something like that. So let's do one more here. 8. 8 is down and to the left. Hey, what do you know? Look at this. So we're moving over here, down and to the left. We have found our destination. And our destination is actually in a foothills. And we have found the dungeon that we are looking for. And we can't go from this sunny day here to the extreme weather. So we're going to stay there because the extreme weather is blocked. So we have actually found our destination. We have found our dungeon. So from that point there, then we could turn into our other hex flower. And this is a hex flower game engine. This is in the heart of the Delve and Dangerous. So this is for generating dungeon adventures. And on the top here, you have the connectivity engine. And this tells you all the different kinds of stairs you're going to find, chambers and junctures, doors, passageways, dead ends, and so on. And then the bottom hex flower is the content engine. And so these are going to tell you what kind of encounters you have while you are building your dungeon. Again, we want to get to the top hex here, which is going to be our goal, our reward. This is where our MacGuffin is. We have different encounter types from weak to strong, and those will add different modifiers to our rolls along the encounters on the right-hand side. We might have low threat areas. We have areas of relative safety. We have different kinds of puzzles, traps, and different kinds of hazards. And so to begin on a dungeon, you need to start with a chamber that has, they suggest, maybe 4 different exits there from the chamber. And we are starting in the center of each hex flower. And for the connectivity engine, we will be rolling a D10. And for the content engine, we will be rolling 2d6. Okay, so let's see. So let's head out in this northern direction here. So for our connectivity engine, we rolled a 2. A 2 goes up 1. We come to a juncture. And then the juncture, we can roll to see how many other exits there are from this juncture. And then for our content engine, we rolled a 5. We would move down here and we would have a low threat area. So at this point, we would determine how many exits there are from the juncture. And then we could also figure out what our encounter was based on this low threat encounter, which gives us a -10 to our roll. So then we come over to our encounter table. We roll a D10 and a D6. So we have 13 minus 10 is 3. And we look at my chart that I have created. We have found a boon from the Untold Encounters book. So then I would turn to my Untold Encounters book. Looking at page 248, my dungeon boons. So I figured boons make sense in a low threat area, something good that we might find. So let's see what we find here in this juncture here. 10. We have found an artist's studio. Interesting. So maybe somebody was coming down in this dungeon to map it. That's how I would play that. Not so much an artist making art, but we found we found the remnants of a mapping station. A cartographer has come down here to explore the dungeon, and maybe we found that his map or her map, and maybe this map actually gives us a fortune point that we can spend to move in a direction we want to move to on the connectivity engine, because we found a partially mapped. We found a map of a partial region of this dungeon. Add that. And so yeah, that's how you use these hex flowers. They're pretty interesting. It does take a little bit of time to wrap your head around. I wish there were more detailed instructions. I wish there was really like a detailed instruction manual on exactly how to use everything about these. But if you read the Goblin Henchman's blog, if you take a look at the detailed example that they have created for using these for dungeons, then you can start to make sense of them. And once you do, the possibilities kind of open up. And I was sitting here, learning these over the last couple weeks, reading about them, and really kind of spending a lot of time with them. And I have grown to really like this system and engine. One thing I would love to see is an entire book filled with different completed hex flower engine mini games. Things for things for different kinds of dungeons, things for different kinds of wilderness exploration, things for different kinds of terminal events like a volcano eruption or maybe like a tidal wave coming in. Various hex flower mini game engines for different kinds of social interactions. A whole book of maybe like 20 or 30 of these pre-made hex flowers could be really useful. And so if you're maybe you're struggling with your games, maybe just rolling on random charts just hasn't been generating the kinds of things that you want to experience in your games, give these a try. They might just kind of unlock something in your brain. They might unlock a segment of your game for you that you haven't been able to tap into yet. And I think as more people start to use these, I think more people will start to generate their own, and the community around these will grow, and we will have more useful hex flower game engines that people are creating. So all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. We will talk to you later. Bye-bye.